Under the warm morning haze of early spring, Oliver Martin adjusted the strap on his field pack as he emerged from the tree line at the edge of a suburban development he had, until recently, only seen marked in zoning overlays and survey maps. To his right stretched a dense woodland preserve under the management of the Department of Natural Resources, where he worked as a field biologist studying the migratory paths of coyotes and native predators. To his left, however, sprawled the immaculately planned neighborhood of Lakebridge Pines, an HOA-governed enclave known for its manicured lawns, low-speed golf carts, and an almost religious dedication to uniformity. His boots were caked in mud, his jacket patterned in camo, and his face drawn from a long night tracking a collared coyote that had veered unusually close to residential boundaries. He was technically still on state-managed forest land, but the invisible social line had already been crossed. He paused to sip water from his canteen and glance back at the clearing from where he came. Natural, rugged, and real. Then, from the corner of his eye, movement. A woman, mid-50s perhaps, wearing a pale cashmere cardigan and holding an insulated mug that matched the muted tones of her porch cushions, was staring at him. No, assessing him. Her gaze wasn't merely curious, it was dissecting. She stood perfectly still on her front step, surrounded by identical houses with identical mailboxes, and watched Oliver like a foreign agent crossing into restricted territory. He gave her a polite nod and continued along the edge of the property, staying clear of the mowed border grass. A moment later, he heard her voice, sharp and deliberate, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me. You're not supposed to be here, are you?" He stopped, adjusted his cap, and turned slightly toward her. "I'm with the Department of Natural Resources. Just returning from overnight fieldwork. Everything's fine." He offered the explanation calmly, not defensively, though he already sensed it wouldn't be enough. The woman raised her eyebrows and gave a rehearsed smile, as if indulging a story she didn't quite believe. "We've had incidents. It's just not ideal to have people dressed like that walking so close to the homes. Makes the kids nervous." Oliver blinked once, then nodded slowly. "Understood." She didn't introduce herself, and he didn't ask. He continued on foot until he reached his department vehicle parked behind the preserve's access gate, threw his gear into the back, and drove off, thinking no more of the exchange than a minor annoyance. But it didn't end there. 2 days later, a typed notice was left wedged under his windshield wiper, the ink laminated against rain. It bore the Lakebridge Pines HOA letterhead and an $800 fine, levied against him for what the letter described as a visually disruptive and threatening presence within the HOA's community perimeter. It cited violations of a bylaw, referencing aesthetic safety, something Oliver had never heard of, nor believed could apply to someone who neither lived in nor trespassed on their land. The most absurd part, the HOA accused him of wearing tactical camouflage in a way that may evoke discomfort or confusion in vulnerable residents. He read the letter twice in disbelief, then again, slower, as if to find some hint of parody. There was none. The fine included a QR code for payment and a short note advising him to dress more appropriately when passing through shared visibility zones. Shared visibility zones. It sounded like satire. But it wasn't. Still wearing his work boots, he drove back to Lakebridge Pines, parked just outside the decorative stone archway that marked its main entrance, and walked straight to the HOA community office at the corner of Magnolia and Creek Bend. The door chimed artificially as he stepped inside, and the receptionist, polite, distracted, asked him to wait. A few minutes later, the woman from the porch entered. Same mug, different sweater. This time she introduced herself. Karen Ellsworth, HOA chairperson. "Oh, Mr. Martin," she said as though greeting a disobedient student. "I had a feeling we'd be hearing from you." He explained, calmly, concisely, and with professional documentation, that he had not crossed onto private land, that his presence was in accordance with state jurisdiction, and that any claims of aesthetic disruption were both baseless and insulting. Karen listened with an expression carefully measured between concern and condescension. When he finished, she offered a light chuckle, then said, "Our bylaws apply to all visual proximities. If someone can see you and you're dressed in a manner that causes alarm, it falls within our right to take corrective action. We are a family-centered community, Mr. Martin." And camouflage, particularly paramilitary patterns, carries very negative associations for some of our residents. Oliver didn't respond immediately. He studied her face. Not hostile, not aggressive, but smug in the way only someone wielding hollow authority can be. He felt a familiar heaviness press down on his chest, not from fear or anger, but from the exhausting recognition that logic would have no place here, that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a power move, subtle in form, but intentional. And as he left the building, the fine notice still folded in his pocket, one thing became clear. This was no longer just about clothing. Oliver didn't consider himself particularly confrontational. Years of solitary fieldwork had taught him to keep to himself, document everything, and speak only when necessary. But as he sat at his kitchen table, the HOA fine now flattened between his palms, that carefully cultivated detachment began to slip. The language in the notice wasn't just officious, it was invasive. Terms like visual perimeter compliance and unsettling visual indicators echoed not like community guidelines but like accusations. The fine itself, $800, wasn't pocket change, and it was issued under the assumption that he was subject to rules he had never agreed to, within a community he didn't even live in. The more he reread it, the more one word stood out: jurisdiction. They were attempting to assert some form of territorial influence beyond their actual property lines, extending their reach into the borderland between the HOA and the state-managed preserve. Oliver wasn't sure whether it was ignorance or arrogance, but either way, it posed a problem. He decided to respond formally through his department's legal counsel. A standard cease and desist was drafted and sent to the HOA, respectfully outlining the overreach and noting that Oliver was operating on state property under authorized capacity. It should have ended there. A quiet retraction, a soft apology, perhaps even silence. Instead, 5 days later, he received another letter, not from the HOA this time, but from a private legal firm representing Lakebridge Pines. The language was sharper, more aggressive. The firm accused him of continued visual disturbance and warned that failure to cease aesthetic encroachment could result in further financial penalties and potential reporting to municipal enforcement. The absurdity was galling. They were treating his lawful work as some kind of act of public provocation, all based on the fact that he wore functional field gear while walking near a line of trees. But that wasn't the worst of it. Later that same week, while setting up new motion-triggered trail cameras near the creek bed, Oliver found something that stopped him cold. A new sign had been hammered into the earth just beyond a walking path, well within the preserve boundary. It wasn't a state-installed marker, and it bore no legal insignia. Just a laminated plaque with the HOA's emblem and the words, "Private Community Surveillance Zone." Non-resident activity monitored and recorded for security purposes. At first glance, it might have seemed harmless, but to someone who understood boundaries, both ecological and legal, it was an act of quiet conquest. They were staking claim, slowly, boldly, inch by inch into territory that wasn't theirs. And nobody else was noticing, because nobody else had a reason to walk these trails in the early morning or check the base of signs for rusted bolts and disturbed soil. Oliver documented the location, took photographs, and returned to his truck with a growing sense of unease. He knew this wasn't just a matter of overzealous rule enforcement anymore. The HOA, or at least someone within it, likely Karen Ellsworth, was actively expanding their control under the guise of community safety. The language they used in the fines and warnings wasn't legal, but it was manipulative, carefully constructed to sound legitimate enough to discourage resistance. And given the average resident's unfamiliarity with jurisdictional nuance, it was probably working. The sign near the trail wasn't alone either. Over the following days, Oliver noticed other changes. Neatly stenciled boundary stones in unnatural places, new trash bins installed along woodland paths, a bench that hadn't been there a week before, bearing the HOA's emblem on a small brass plate. The forest was being slowly repainted as community property. When he brought these concerns to his regional supervisor at the Department of Natural Resources, he received an understanding nod and an offer to submit a formal land use report, but little more. "We'll file the incursion," the supervisor had said, "but unless it escalates into environmental damage or physical obstruction, our jurisdiction doesn't allow much enforcement." HOA disputes are notoriously gray areas. Gray areas. That was the worst of it. Oliver had thought that working for a state agency might shield him from the same kinds of pettiness he'd seen neighbors inflict on each other in suburban communities. But Karen wasn't just petty. She was organized. And she was beginning to craft a narrative in which he was the intruder. The real shift happened 2 weeks later. Oliver arrived at the preserve trailhead before dawn to check a motion sensor that had been reporting faulty data. He found it smashed, its casing dented as if struck with something heavy. Nearby, the ground had been disturbed. It wasn't vandalism from teens or natural damage. He knew those signs. This was targeted, deliberate. And 50 feet away, zip-tied to a low branch facing the trail, was a trail camera. One he didn't install. He recognized it as a consumer-grade model, the kind sold in sporting goods stores. Inside, the housing was a memory card, but when he checked the timestamp of the most recent recordings, he realized they aligned perfectly with his patrol hours. Someone had been tracking him, watching him move through state land. He reported the incident immediately and filed an internal memo. The camera was submitted for data analysis, though they doubted law enforcement would act unless the footage revealed something criminal. That same day, a resident complaint was forwarded to the department, alleging that a man in camouflage with unmarked gear had been seen entering backyards adjacent to the preserve under the cover of night. The complaint, unsigned but clearly part of an HOA correspondence chain, included a blurry photo of Oliver taken from a distance, mid-step between brush and pavement. It was cropped poorly and labeled "Possible Trespass Suspect." This was no longer speculation, it was defamation, organized and strategic. Still, Oliver tried to keep his cool. He knew what would happen if he responded emotionally. Any misstep, any burst of anger would be used to confirm their claims. But the tension was mounting, and the nature of the conflict was mutating into something more invasive than he'd anticipated. It wasn't just HOA overreach anymore. It was personal. A few evenings later, while reviewing thermal images of coyote movement along the outer trails, Oliver noticed an anomaly. Heat signatures resembling a group of figures had appeared multiple times just after midnight, all centered around the northern access point of the preserve that bordered the HOA's largest cul-de-sac. Each time the figures approached, lingered, and then withdrew. No damage had been recorded, but the pattern was unmistakable. When he returned to the location the next morning, a new set of small wooden stakes had been driven into the ground near the tree line, each topped with orange flags commonly used in utility marking. They weren't part of any ongoing project, and no permits had been filed through the municipal database. Someone was preparing for something. Expansion? Construction? He couldn't be sure. That night, Oliver didn't sleep well. The air in his modest apartment felt thinner than usual, as if the stress had begun to take physical form. He had no family in the area, few close friends, and even fewer allies within the community. As far as the HOA was concerned, he was simply an unwanted presence that had wandered too close to their illusion of control. But to Oliver, the conflict was becoming something bigger, a test of how far a system built on suburban politeness and bureaucratic jargon could go before it snapped, and whether someone like him, quiet and methodical, had it in him to push back. By the start of the third week, something had undeniably shifted in the atmosphere surrounding Oliver's work. His usual routes, once quiet and untouched, began to feel like contested ground. The forest, which had always been a space of observation and quiet analysis, was now peppered with small intrusions that didn't fit. A wooden trailhead kiosk, clearly new, had been installed just inside the preserve's edge near the southeast path. It bore the HOA's emblem once again, accompanied by laminated flyers inviting residents to join the Lakebridge Pines Woodland Guardians initiative. The language was couched in environmental rhetoric, calls to protect local habitats and monitor unknown activity, but it was clear what it really meant. They were deputizing neighbors, giving curious joggers and amateur birdwatchers a sense of authority they didn't legally possess, turning them into eyes. For Oliver, it wasn't just irritating, it was strategically dangerous. He relied on predictable behavior in his study areas to gather reliable data. Now, with HOA-sanctioned foot traffic trampling through wildlife corridors and impromptu eco-volunteers installing unapproved birdhouses and seed stations, his readings were becoming erratic. Species he'd been tracking for months were shifting their patterns, and no small part of him suspected that was the entire point. The HOA wasn't just trying to push him out through administrative tactics. They were destabilizing the environment itself, undermining the core of his professional purpose. Then came the email. It arrived late one evening from an anonymous address. No name, just the domain citizensalert.org, which redirected to a broken homepage. The message was short, clipped, and without greeting. You've been reported to Neighborhood Watch for suspicious forest activity. Watch your step. HOA records everything. Attached was a blurry photograph of Oliver walking to his truck, time-stamped, with metadata that traced back to a camera he hadn't installed. There was no direct threat, nothing overtly actionable, but the message was clear. He was being watched, not by one person but by a collective, a self-appointed group convinced he was a problem in need of correction. The next day, Oliver drove the perimeter of the preserve, mapping the points where HOA-installed signs had spread like mold. In total, 11 markers now stood on state land. Some were bolted into trees, others embedded in the ground with cement. All claimed to denote shared safety zones. He contacted the local zoning office and was told no permits had been filed, but unless the Department of Natural Resources filed a formal obstruction complaint, they weren't authorized to remove them. Bureaucracy moved slowly, and the HOA knew it. They were building facts on the ground faster than any department could react. That evening, Oliver tried something different. Rather than confront the HOA directly, he attended one of their open community meetings. He didn't dress in uniform or make his presence known in advance, just wore plain jeans and a sweater, blending in as best he could. The meeting was held in the community hall, an over-renovated space lined with beige folding chairs and coffee urns. Karen Ellsworth stood at the podium, framed by potted ferns and a projection screen that read, Q2 Vision, Safety, Community, Harmony. What followed felt more like a church revival than a homeowner's discussion. Karen spoke at length about preserving the visual and emotional integrity of Lakebridge Pines, warned about external elements disrupting the aesthetic peace, and praised the recent efforts of residents who had taken it upon themselves to reclaim our natural spaces. No one named Oliver directly, but it didn't matter. The entire speech revolved around him, around the idea of him, a man in camouflage, foreign and uninvited, threatening their carefully curated order. He watched, silent and still, as one man raised his hand and asked if it was true that some outsider was patrolling the woods with surveillance gear. Karen responded with a serene smile. "We can't confirm identities," she said, "but we do urge all residents to report any suspicious behavior near the tree line. Better safe than sorry." Oliver left the meeting with clenched teeth and a bitter taste in his mouth. It wasn't just the lies, it was the ease with which they spread. People wanted to believe her. It gave them purpose. Within 2 days, several residents began installing new motion-activated lights at the rear ends of their properties, aimed not at their own backyards, but toward the trees. One even posted a sign near the fence. "No loitering." Neighborhood monitored by aerial drones. It was amateur paranoia dressed as civic duty. And then came the moment that solidified the escalation. On a Thursday morning, just after dawn, Oliver returned to his vehicle parked in the small lot adjacent to the preserve. The back window had been shattered. Not a random break, not vandalism, but a surgical strike. Nothing stolen, but the rear seats had been rifled through. Field notebooks, maps, and printed reports were left scattered and bent, some damp from the morning dew. A single page had been torn cleanly from one of his logbooks and placed under his windshield wiper. On it, someone had written in block letters with red marker, "Your job doesn't make you untouchable." He filed a report with the police, but the response was perfunctory. "Probably kids," the officer said with a shrug. "No cameras in that parking lot. Nothing to go on." Oliver mentioned the ongoing dispute with the HOA. The signs, the surveillance, the threatening messages, but the officer's eyes glazed over halfway through the explanation. "Sounds like a civil matter," he said. "Not criminal unless they catch someone in the act." Back at his apartment, Oliver stared at the blank space in his notebook where the missing page had been. It wasn't just data. It was a map of coyote dens he'd been tracking, including specific GPS markers. Whoever had taken it likely didn't understand what it was, but the symbolism was unmistakable. They had entered his professional space, defiled it, and left a message as if to say, "You don't belong here." He considered calling his supervisor again, pushing harder for departmental action, but a deeper instinct told him that wouldn't be enough. What was happening now didn't fit the standard categories of land use violation or overreach. It was more psychological, more insidious. The HOA had transformed his legitimate work into the specter of danger, and they weren't waiting for him to make a mistake. They were crafting one for him. By the time night fell, Oliver found himself sitting in his truck, parked in darkness, engine off, facing the tree line. He watched as the lights from the HOA houses flickered on in intervals, forming a wall of illumination that pressed against the woods. The forest, once his sanctuary, now shimmered with artificial scrutiny. For the first time in years, he felt like prey. And he realized that this wasn't simply about signs or fines or even personal resentment. It was a coordinated effort to make him feel unwelcome, unsafe, and outnumbered. It was escalation by erasure, slow, quiet, and deliberate. And unless he found a way to fight it on their terms, he would lose everything he had built. The tipping point came not with a confrontation, not with shouting or police intervention or any single moment of clear aggression. It came in the form of a silent adjustment, a correction made not to Oliver's work or conduct, but to the narrative surrounding him. For the first time since the conflict began, he felt it not just at the edge of the forest or from HOA signage or behind the windows of passing golf carts. He felt it from inside his own agency, the Department of Natural Resources, which had previously treated his complaints about HOA interference as minor annoyances, sent a formal request for a geographic reassignment review, citing multiple community complaints and ongoing concerns. About interjurisdictional harmony, it wasn't an order. Not yet, but it was the bureaucratic equivalent of a loaded question. Would it be easier for everyone if Oliver simply moved his work elsewhere? He read the notice 3 times in his office, stunned by its cold neutrality. There was no mention of his field reports being compromised by unauthorized civilian interference. No reference to the destroyed trail cameras or the damaged vehicle, or the growing encroachments into protected land. Just polite, bureaucratic language about minimizing friction and exploring alternative observation zones, further from residential boundaries. He knew what it meant. Give in. Leave the problem behind. Start over somewhere that didn't make people uncomfortable with your presence. The suggestion alone was a blow. After years of service, after mapping migratory patterns and conducting field work that had contributed to multiple state-level conservation policies, he was being nudged aside like a malfunctioning sensor. But Oliver wasn't ready to go quietly. That same evening, he returned to the southern edge of the preserve, the sector closest to Lakebridge Pines, and began documenting every unauthorized structure, sign, and artificial light source within a quarter-mile radius of the HOA boundary. He compiled it all into a detailed visual report, complete with timestamps, GPS data, and satellite overlays. He submitted it to the agency's Environmental Compliance Division with the subject line, Coordinated Visual and Spatial Violations of Protected Land by HOA Entity. It was formal, precise, and utterly without emotional language. He knew that facts, when laid plainly and without drama, were harder to ignore. 2 days later, the division responded. An internal investigator was assigned to conduct a quiet review of the site. No publicity. No formal visits yet. Just data gathering. It was the first acknowledgement from within the system that something might be wrong. Oliver felt the faintest flicker of hope, but hope alone wouldn't stop what came next. A week later, during his regular night patrol, Oliver discovered something strange near one of the shallow creeks that cut across the preserve. Someone had planted low-level LED beacons in the soil, tiny, nearly invisible from a distance, but glowing softly with motion detection triggers when approached. They weren't standard trail equipment, and they certainly weren't installed by the state. He disabled them carefully, collected 3 units for analysis, and left markers indicating their former location. These weren't the kind of tools hobbyists used. Someone had access to real equipment, and the nerve to use it. When he returned the next morning to collect additional evidence, the beacons were gone. All of them. The dirt had been smoothed over, prints disrupted. But one thing remained. A laminated note pinned to the trunk of a cedar tree, bearing no name. Just the HOA seal at the top and a message in block letters. Please refrain from tampering with safety enhancements. Your cooperation is expected. It was placed at eye level, deliberate, mocking. Not only were they escalating their surveillance, they were now defending it in writing. That afternoon, Oliver visited the county records office. He requested the most recent land usage petitions filed by any private entity or HOA in the region surrounding Lakebridge Pines. What he found shocked him, not because of its illegality, but because of how cleverly legal it appeared. Over the last 8 months, the HOA had submitted a series of small, incremental proposals for community beautification easements and forest trail engagement zones, none of which mentioned actual structural development, but all of which blurred the lines of property boundaries. Each individual request was minor, non-invasive, just enough to pass under scrutiny, but collectively, when mapped together, they formed a growing footprint that extended into the preserve like a slow invasion. The most alarming part, many of the approvals had already been signed by mid-level zoning officials, likely unaware of the broader pattern. The HOA was using bureaucracy as camouflage, disguising territorial expansion as aesthetic improvement. It was brilliant, and it was working. That evening, Oliver sat in his truck staring at the forest. Not the animals this time, but the trailheads, the fake signs, the cameras nestled in brush that didn't belong to the department. For the first time, he truly saw the scale of the thing. This wasn't Karen Ellsworth being petty. It wasn't one neighborhood overreaching. It was a coordinated campaign to reshape the environment, physically, perceptually, legally, until Oliver and anyone like him no longer fit. He wasn't just an inconvenience, he was an obstacle. Still, there was one thing they hadn't considered. People don't forget what the real landscape looks like once they've lived in it long enough. Oliver didn't need signs or markers. He knew the ridgelines, the water patterns, the animal paths. He began to cross-reference old satellite imagery with current zoning maps and his own field notes. What emerged was clear: a pattern of deliberate misrepresentation. Trees that had been standing for decades were now labeled as planned green space. Dry stream beds were being relabeled as potential runoff management zones. Someone was rewriting the map. Fueled by a renewed sense of clarity, Oliver returned to the Environmental Compliance Division, not with complaints this time, but with a presentation. He laid out every piece of evidence: the spatial creep of the HOA, the misuse of jurisdictional language, the rebranded forest zones, and the technology planted without permit. The investigator assigned to his case listened intently. Then, for the first time, they asked a question that didn't come from a script. "Have you ever spoken directly with the zoning office?" He hadn't, not yet. The next morning, Oliver scheduled a meeting with the lead zoning administrator. He presented the full progression of the HOA's encroachment, not with outrage but with quiet authority. The administrator, a man who had likely rubber-stamped half the beautification easements without realizing what they implied, grew visibly uneasy as Oliver laid out the broader scheme. "They said these were just picnic paths," he muttered. "Public relaxation areas for the residents." Oliver nodded once. "Except none of it is on their land." That same week, all further permits from Lakebridge Pines were frozen pending review. When word of the freeze reached the HOA, the shift was immediate. Karen Ellsworth released a memo to residents warning of external interference in community planning and malicious attempts to discredit neighborhood stewardship. She never mentioned Oliver by name, but her phrasing was unmistakable. Meanwhile, a second trail camera, this one obviously newer, was found smashed near a deer blind. It had been yanked from its mounting and crushed underfoot. This time, nothing was stolen, just destroyed. Oliver filed the report, but deeper down, he knew the pattern was shifting. The HOA was reacting now. Scrambling. That meant momentum was finally tilting in his favor. For the first time since the beginning, they were on the defensive. And even though the forest was still littered with false signs and plastic smiles, something had broken in their pattern. He sat again that night at the southern edge of the preserve, wind brushing across the grass as twilight darkened the treetops. He could still feel their eyes, neighbors with binoculars, motion lights flickering across empty trails, but they no longer felt invincible. Now they felt desperate, and desperation had edges sharper than control. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but Oliver knew something they didn't. He wasn't going anywhere. The retaliation didn't arrive in the form of another note or shattered equipment. It arrived through silence. A heavy, humming quiet that settled around the edges of Oliver's world like smoke. For several days after the permit freeze, there were no new fines, no angry emails, no sightings of misplaced signs or sudden nighttime activity. Even the neighborhood forums, which he occasionally monitored under a pseudonym, went still. Lakebridge Pines appeared to retreat, its fences clean, its trails undisturbed. On the surface, it looked like the calm that followed accountability. But Oliver knew better. These people didn't retreat. They regrouped. His confirmation came unexpectedly, from a local maintenance worker he'd known for years, a quiet man named Rudy who sometimes serviced utility lines that ran through the outskirts of the preserve. Rudy was older, half-deaf, with the kind of social invisibility that made him a perfect accidental witness. On a foggy morning, as Oliver stood checking a tracking collar frequency near one of the ridge markers, Rudy approached on his quad and parked with a grunt. "Saw a few suits poking around up here last night," he muttered, gesturing toward the creek bed. "Not your kind. HOA types. Not from the neighborhood either." He scratched his chin. "Black SUV. No plates. Came through after sundown. Had those little red lights on their phones." He didn't elaborate further. He didn't need to. Oliver went quiet for a moment, scanning the area around the ridgeline, then asked the only question that mattered. "Did they install anything?" Rudy shrugged. "Didn't stick around. Didn't want to end up on some list." That, too, said everything. Even men like Rudy, who prided themselves on staying out of drama, knew there was something about Lakebridge Pines that didn't sit right anymore. Later that day, Oliver returned to the location Rudy had pointed out. He found fresh tire tracks, deep ones, not from an off-road vehicle but from something heavier. He walked the perimeter for nearly an hour before noticing the subtle change. A buried plastic casing beneath a stand of low ferns, barely visible, likely containing a concealed power unit or signal relay. Whatever it wasn't his equipment, and it wasn't state-issued. He documented it carefully, marked the location, and didn't touch it further. This time, he wanted to track what they were doing, not just react to it. 2 nights later, the aggression turned administrative. A package was delivered to Oliver's door, officially stamped, return address masked through a forwarding service. Inside were printouts of new legal documents, HOA issued Notice of Civil Accountability, for what they called repeated unauthorized interference in designated community safety operations. The documents were professional, overly so, dense with layered legal jargon that, to an untrained eye, might seem legitimate. The implication was clear. Oliver was being sued, not by a court of law, but by the HOA's internal legal board, an entity with no real jurisdiction outside of its own covenants. Still, it looked real, and for most people, that was enough to cause panic. But Oliver didn't panic. He took the packet to his agency's legal department, where a real attorney flipped through the pages and gave a bemused shake of the head. "None of this holds," she said. "It's a scare tactic, but a sophisticated one. They're trying to bait you into responding emotionally." She paused. "The real risk is that they're probably not aiming to win. They're trying to exhaust you." That, he realized, was the next evolution of their strategy. Not to defeat him in some sudden dramatic gesture, but to drain his time, his focus, his energy. To mire him in endless paperwork and defensive measures while their actual goal, ownership by erosion, continued uninterrupted. Worse, the pressure wasn't only professional anymore. Over the next week, Oliver noticed strange occurrences near his apartment complex. Unfamiliar cars parked too long across the street, his mailbox left open and empty, though he hadn't removed his mail. Lights flickering in his hallway late at night, without reason. He couldn't prove it was connected to Lakebridge Pines, but the timing was too precise. The shift from local suppression to personal disruption marked a new phase. He began storing sensitive equipment off-site and changed the locks on his storage unit. He didn't carry a firearm. His department didn't authorize them for biologists, but he bought a reinforced flashlight with a built-in alarm and started keeping it by the door. What finally broke the illusion of containment was the wildlife itself. One morning, while checking a series of collar pings in the north sector, Oliver noticed irregularities. 2 coyotes that had previously maintained wide territorial range were now circling in increasingly narrow loops. When he investigated, he discovered a new obstruction, segments of mesh fencing, barely visible behind a line of shrubs, creating a corridor that funneled wildlife away from their usual trails and toward a newly cleared path connecting directly to the HOA walking circuit. It was not only illegal, it was dangerous. The fence had gaps low enough for smaller mammals but forced larger animals like the collared coyotes into condensed movement zones. When he traced the fencing to its anchor point, he found fresh concrete poured beside a tree and a tiny bronze plaque embedded in the base. Lake Bridge Pines Community Wildlife Pathway. Established Isonazibanyun. It wasn't even subtle anymore. They were reshaping nature, framing it as a gift to the community, and slowly eliminating the need for his presence altogether. That night, Oliver didn't sleep. He sat on the floor of his apartment surrounded by maps, markers, correspondence, and images. His walls were filled with pinned photos of animal patterns disrupted, satellite overlays of encroaching HOA lines, and charts comparing noise pollution over the last 3 months. He stared at them, not with anger, but with grim recognition. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't negligence or even aggressive neighbor politics. This was strategy, intentional, distributed, and built to look benign. He remembered something Rudy had said that morning, almost offhand, when discussing the quiet SUVs. Some of those HOA folks used to be consultants. You know, real estate engineering, environmental zoning manipulation. Got fancy names for it now. The thought stuck with him. This wasn't just a group of retirees playing property games. This was organized, potentially commercial, with far-reaching implications beyond the borders of a single suburban neighborhood. The next day, he submitted a formal escalation request to the state's Environmental Ethics Board, bypassing internal bureaucracy. Attached were his full findings: over 50 pages of documentation, photography, zoning inconsistencies, and behavioral disruptions across both human and animal populations. He didn't frame it as a personal battle. He framed it as what it had become: a systemic manipulation of public land disguised as communal improvement. He ended the report with one final paragraph. When control is taken incrementally, disguised as order, it becomes nearly invisible to those who do not walk the lines daily. But I do, and I have. And I see it now for what it is: not development, not stewardship, but a quiet annexation, one fence at a time. The board acknowledged receipt within 48 hours. A hearing date was proposed. Not a trial, not yet, but a real public review. Lakebridge Pines would have to speak in front of someone they didn't control. And that, Oliver thought as he returned once again to the disrupted trail paths, might finally be enough to break the illusion. The hearing wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no slamming of fists or walkouts. That would have been too easy, too visible, too correctable. Instead, the room filled with a sterile tension, the kind that settled in institutional air-conditioned spaces designed to neutralize conflict through carpeting and beige paint. The State Environmental Ethics Board had convened in one of the municipal administrative chambers, formally neutral ground, but far from emotionless. Representatives from various departments sat behind long tables with microphones that only worked half the time. Karen Ellsworth arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a pale blue blazer, armed with an architectural binder filled with renderings of idyllic walking paths and smiling children beneath stylized trees. Her face radiated measured offense as though she were the one being intruded upon. She greeted board members with warm restraint, introduced herself as the interim planning liaison for Lakebridge Pines, and took her seat as if she had nothing to prove. Oliver arrived exactly on time. He brought no lawyer, no press, no entourage, just a battered laptop, a weathered folder of field reports, and a jump drive loaded with 3 years of ground data, animal migration paths, trail camera footage, and satellite overlays. His voice was even as he began. He didn't speak in outrage or accusation. He simply laid out what had happened, how signs and lights had appeared in unauthorized zones, how easements, had been quietly stitched together into a false sense of legal coverage, how wildlife had shifted their movement patterns due to artificial deterrence, how surveillance had been installed without permits, and how each action, taken alone, seemed minor, but together formed a map of deliberate appropriation. When it was Karen's turn, she spoke softly, almost mournfully, about community cohesion, about safety, about creating shared spaces that blended, responsibly, with the natural environment. She said the HOA had merely sought to enhance appreciation of the land, to make it welcoming to all age groups. She presented no permits, just letters of support from residents, many of them vague, most of them identical in phrasing. She claimed that Oliver had misinterpreted intention and had possibly escalated tensions through confrontational behavior. She smiled when she said it, her voice the verbal equivalent of lavender sachets and HOA newsletters. One of the board members, an older woman with years of zoning review experience in her posture alone, leaned forward and asked a single question that sliced through the niceties. Were any of these enhancements, signs, lighting, fencing, cleared through the appropriate land use channels before installation? Karen blinked slowly. Not at first, she admitted, but given the scope and harmlessness of the additions, we believed informal community support was a valid substitute for formal bureaucratic steps. It was a mistake. The room didn't erupt. It simply cooled. Oliver didn't smile. He didn't need to. The data had already spoken. The board concluded the session with the promise of a ruling within 10 business days, but the tone of their questions had already cast the outcome into the realm of inevitability. Karen walked out stiffly, binder pressed tightly to her chest, no longer making eye contact with anyone. But that wasn't the true culmination. The following evening, as Oliver was walking the edge of the preserve near dusk, he saw something unexpected. A small crowd gathered near the original trailhead, mostly Lakebridge Pines residents, standing in uneasy silence around a pile of dismantled signs and ripped-up boundary flags. At the center stood a man Oliver didn't recognize. Tall, mid-40s, wearing HOA colors but with a visible tremor in his hand as he clutched a clipboard. He was announcing, in halting terms, that due to an interim injunction from the county, all non-approved markers would be removed pending review. Behind him, 2 city workers began unscrewing metal posts and loading them into a flatbed truck. Someone in the crowd asked whether the benches would stay. Someone else asked who had started this mess. The man didn't answer either question. Karen was nowhere in sight. Oliver didn't stop walking. He didn't acknowledge the gathering, but as he passed the edge of the scene, he caught the eye of one woman standing alone with her arms crossed. She didn't smile or nod, but she didn't look away either. There was no warmth in her face, but there was a flicker of something else. Not respect, acknowledgement. Back at his truck, he paused before getting in. The forest behind him was still scarred. The coyotes hadn't returned to their original paths. The roots of trees had been disturbed. Cameras had been stolen. Trails had been redrawn in people's minds. But the signs were coming down. The permits were frozen. The hearing was over. It wasn't victory, not in the conventional sense. But it was the moment the current broke. Not with violence, but with fracture. The illusion of control, so carefully maintained by polished phrases and community pride, had been cracked open by one man's refusal to play along. And though the forest would need time to reset, Oliver knew he had held the line. The weeks that followed unfolded with the quiet rhythm of repair rather than triumph. The board's ruling arrived in the form of a long, measured document that avoided dramatic language but carried real weight. Lakebridge Pines was ordered to remove all unauthorized structures, signage, and barriers within the preserve. And, further, applications for easements were suspended pending independent oversight. For Oliver, the decision read less like victory and more like confirmation of what he had already known, that the land was never theirs to claim, and the illusion of ownership collapsed the moment it was forced into the open. Karen Ellsworth resigned from her chair position under the vague excuse of personal commitments, though word traveled quickly that she had been quietly pressured out by her own board after the hearing. The neighborhood still whispered, still eyed him with suspicion when he passed, but the machinery that had once moved against him had stalled, fractured by exposure. Out in the preserve, the forest began to breathe again. The artificial lights that once pierced the undergrowth were dismantled, the benches uprooted, the false plaques pried from the soil and stacked in neat piles awaiting disposal. Coyotes slowly widened their range again, tentative at first, then with growing confidence as the trails quieted. Oliver found himself lingering longer on patrols, less as a guard and more as a witness to the land reclaiming itself. Yet the satisfaction carried an edge of melancholy. He knew scars remained, not all visible, not all in the soil. He had seen how easily lines could be blurred, how quickly paper and signatures could attempt to erase reality. That knowledge would never leave him. One evening, as he finished recording caller data, Oliver paused by the southern ridge, the place where Karen had first spoken to him months earlier. The houses of Lake Ridge Pines glowed in the distance, orderly, bright, their fences holding back carefully measured lives. He wondered how many of those residents had truly believed in her narrative and how many had simply accepted it because it was easier. He would never know. What he did know was that the forest still stood, not because it was invulnerable, but because someone had refused to yield when yielding would have been simpler. He placed his hand against the rough bark of a cedar, listening to the steady hum of crickets rising with the dusk, and for the first time in many weeks, he let the silence settle without suspicion. The land was never his, not in ownership but in guardianship, and that was enough.